Constantin Reliu looks remarkably good for a man who has been officially dead since 2003. Imagine sitting in an empty apartment in Betrayal, Romania, pacing the floor, smoking scavenged cigarette butts, and cursing the wife who entirely erased you from the world. He's a man who breathes, he walks, he speaks. Yet a judge looked this living, breathing human in the eye and confirmed the absolute impossible. According to the laws of the Romanian state, Constantin Reliu is deceased. And that ruling? Well, that ruling is final.
The sheer horror of his non-existence didn't hit him all at once. It fully revealed itself in January 2018 at a border he had desperately tried to forget. He'd been working as a chef in Turkey for nearly 20 years when he was detained for expired papers and deported. Right there at the Bucharest airport, 2 border guards took his passport and delivered a shock so profound that, in his own words, his mouth, throat, and tongue turned to dust in seconds. They denied him entry into his own country because, officially speaking, he had ceased to exist. What followed was 6 grueling hours of intense biological scrutiny. They stripped down every physical metric they could find. They actually measured the exact geometric distance between his eyes to see if it aligned with a faded, years-old photograph. They aggressively interrogated him on the hidden local geography of Betrayal to test his memory. They mapped his fingerprints, hunting through the system for digital ghosts. The physical evidence was entirely overwhelming. Eventually, the guards had to admit that the flesh-and-blood man standing right in front of them was, without a doubt, Constantin Reliu. But here is the terrifying catch. Flesh and blood mean absolutely nothing to the administrative machine. His biological reality was entirely irrelevant. He had become a living ghost, completely trapped by an instrumentum probationum. That is a probate document, a legal file that has already been closed, sealed, and finalized. The sheer, undeniable physical evidence of his pulse couldn't even put a dent in the rigid authority of this paperwork. A fictitious file literally overrides a beating heart. The officials refused to officially acknowledge the living human standing right there in the room, creating this profound existential dread. The bureaucratic machine had calculated his fate, and it was utterly unconcerned with his voice, his warmth, or his physical presence. And you need to understand, this isn't just some poetic metaphor for feeling isolated. It is a literal, statutory erasure, known precisely as civil death. Through this terrifying mechanism, a living human is entirely stripped of their legal personhood. Constantin was standing there, physically occupying space, yet completely void of the fundamental human rights that define us in modern society. To grasp how this happens, you have to look at the unyielding foundation of modern bureaucracy. Civil status is a non-patrimonial right, individualizing a person. It's locked down by uncompromising principles. There's unavailability, meaning it cannot be alienated or transferred. There's indivisibility, meaning you can only possess one status at a time. But the most devastating principle of all, imprescriptibility. Once that record is processed, it hardens into the ultimate unyielding truth of the state. The architect behind this absolute erasure was actually his own estranged wife, Joan. Back in 2016, after nearly 2 decades of silence, she weaponized these unyielding rules. Relying on the testimony of just 2 witnesses, she falsely claimed to the state that he had died in the catastrophic 1999 Turkish earthquake. She fabricated a file that Reliu himself calls a bitter joke, a file stating he died in 1999, while paradoxically containing notes that he was still actively working in 2001. But the contradiction didn't matter. Once that death certificate was generated, the principle of imprescriptibility kicked in. The state now only recognized the ink on the page. He wasn't a man anymore. He was permanently transformed into anomalous, rotten code in the national registers. He became a systemic error that the government simply refused to debug. For Constantin, being deleted by a bureaucracy felt like something far darker than a simple administrative glitch. It felt deeply personal, like a curse. He claims his wife wanted him legally dead to seize his apartment, his car, and his mother's house. To him, this legal death was the physical manifestation of witchcraft. He tells this chilling story of finding a blouse hidden deep in a closet, with the wing of a raven deliberately sewn right into the sleeve. A wizard in Turkey even warned him that breaking this spell was impossible without an object belonging to his wife. Whether you believe in the supernatural or just the cold brutality of bureaucracy, you can't deny that the curse worked perfectly. It completely severed him from society. His life became entirely stagnant, no job, no electricity, and horrifyingly, he developed unexplained paralyzed fingers. He couldn't even cut his own food. But he couldn't get a simple medical test to figure out why, Because doctors require a health card, and you absolutely cannot obtain a health card when the state considers you legally deceased. Trapped in this unending legal purgatory, a person's mind starts to descend. Constantine obsessively cultivated exactly 4,750 ideas for vengeance. The psychological weight of being a living corpse consumed his entire existence. He anchored his sanity to one thing, calculating relentless retribution against the system and the woman who engineered his demise. The collision between flesh and paper finally happened in March 2018, inside a Vaslui courtroom. Reliu stood before a judge essentially begging the court to just listen to his beating heart. But the biological reality of his pulse meant nothing in that room. The court's priority was entirely focused on the clock, the inflexible, unforgiving statute of limitations. Because he had missed the deadline, he had officially become a statutory ghost. That's what happens when an individual misses the legal window to prove they didn't die. The administrative record hardens into a permanent tomb. The justice system isn't engineered to care about the physical man breathing in the room. It only cares about the deadlines tied to his file. So the judge looked directly at a living, breathing man and delivered a devastating final ruling. The Vaslui court officially rejected his claim to be alive because his request for resurrection was filed too late. The gavel fell. His physical presence couldn't undo the expiration of a bureaucratic deadline. He was stranded in the bleak afterlife of the legal system. Think about the reality of this. He was banned for life from Turkey and permanently considered a corpse by Romania, stripped of all income, legal rights, and the ability to cross borders. Completely devoid of purpose, he heavily contemplated suicide. To him, it felt like the only logical exit from a world that bluntly refused to acknowledge he was alive. But you can't contain the sheer chaotic absurdity of a living man suing himself for non-existence. After that crushing setback in Vaslui, his story exploded globally. That intense notoriety forced the machinery of the state to take a second look at its own terrifying logic, propelling him to a second court attempt in Barlad in July 2018. Unspooling this nightmare required navigating a labyrinth of decades. Officially recorded as dead in 2003 because of a certificate fabricated in 2016, the brutal rejection by the Vaslui court in March 2018. Finally, in July 2018, the court in Barlad annulled the death certificate. At long last, his biological reality was allowed to align with the state's record. Yet, even in victory, the terror lingered. That ruling came with a highly precarious 30-day window. For 30 agonizing days, anyone who doubted his physical existence could file an appeal and officially plunge him right back into the grave. The rotten code hovered over him, threatening to overwrite him one last time. The chilling, undeniable truth about civil status documents is simply this: your physical body is entirely secondary. Your identity is not some inherent biological right derived from the fact that your heart beats. It is a remarkably fragile, easily revocable status granted by the state. We are, quite literally, only as alive as our paperwork says we are. Constantin Reliu survived his deletion, but his nightmare leaves a permanent scar on how we understand our own existence. It forces a question you never thought you'd have to ask. How would you prove you are alive if the only person with the power to listen already thinks you're a ghost? In a world strictly governed by paper, your physical existence might just be the most terrifyingly fragile illusion of all.